Hi and welcome to this DCP web tutorial. In today's tutorial I'm going to show you how to change the size of particles in Blender 2.9. Okay, before we open up Blender I'm just going to open up the web browser, and I made this tutorial quite a while ago, around April 2019, and it's about Blender particle systems. And there was someone that wrote a comment in here recently, just like 4 hours ago. It says, I'm still having immense amount of difficulty setting up size of the particles. Every part of your tutorial I can emulate except for the size of individual particles, unless I muck about till it does get right. By then I've forgotten what I did to correct the situation. If you could do a tutorial or simply adjusting the size and the volume and the physical quantities of particles, I will send you one of my guitars. So let's not worry about the guitar. Let's just try and make a little tutorial showing this gentleman how to manage and change the sizes and the volume and the quantity of particles inside Blender. Before we go to the tutorial, I just want to show you this one video that I created. This one I created more recently, only a few months ago, and it's around 2 hours long, right? 2 hours 30 minutes, and it's a really sort of in-depth tutorial on particle systems in Blender. So I'll put a link to both of those videos in the YouTube description so that you can follow along, and maybe you want to go and check out this tutorial and you can really learn more in-depth information about particle systems. Okay, so let's go ahead and close down the web browser, and we'll go ahead and open up Blender. I'm using 2.91 at present, so I've got I believe the latest version of Blender running, so it's 2.91 here. So let's go ahead and click on general here, and we just got a blank general settings for Blender here. I'm just going to press N on my keyboard, and you don't need to do this, but I'm just going to turn on my screencast keys. So if you want to see my key presses, you can see them down here. So we've got a camera, we've got a light source, and we've got a cube. And we want to create a quick particle system to explain how to manipulate different particles inside Blender. So to make this demonstration a bit easier, let's go ahead and click on the cube and then hit the delete key to get rid of that. I'm going to press Shift and A, and in this case I'm going to just insert a plane, just a simple plane like this, right? And this is a mesh based object, so when we go to object, edit, we can see that it's got vertices and it's a mesh based object. So particles need to be emitted from mesh based objects, as I understand it. So what I'm going to do is press number 1 on my keyboard. Number 1 takes us into the front orthographic, and we can see the camera here and the light source, and we can see our mesh or our plane here. So I'm just going to use the move tool and then just grab it by the handle and just drag it up a little bit, and then I'm going to press Control Alt and 0. Control Alt 0 moves the camera to the current orthographic view, right? So now we can see the camera's perspective is looking at this scene, and the plane is just above the camera, so we won't actually see the particles being emitted. They'll just drop down, as in this example. Okay, let's go ahead and use our wisdom, and the wisdom tells me that I better start saving this work because sod's law, something will happen. So let's just go into here and let's just call it particle -01. So I'm just going to save the file, and let's just save this. So let's go, we're in solid view at the moment, that should be fine. We've got the plane, and let's just call this particle emitter. I'm just going to rename it to particle emitter here. So let's give our objects a sensible name, and we need to create a particle in order for Blender to, or we need to create an object in order for Blender to use that as a particle. So I'm just going to move my mouse cursor over here, press Shift and A, and we're going to use cubes this time. In my previous tutorial we used spheres, but today we're going to use cubes, right? Let's do something a bit different. So we've got a cube here. I'm just going to middle mouse click, just rotate around. We can see this cube here, and we can see our mesh or our plane at the top here. And we want to take this object and emit particles from this plane. So I'm just going to grab the cube and move it out of the way of the camera view, so it's just over here somewhere. And for now we'll click on the plane, which is our particle emitter. And in fact this cube, we should rename it particles, or let's call it particle 1. That would be the wisest thing to call it, right? Particle 1. This is the first particle. So let's click on the plane and go to the particle systems, and we're going to create a new particle system by clicking the plus sign here, and we see all the different particle settings. So we can see numbers, we can see all these things. I'm going to go through them briefly, but remember in my other tutorial I went through all of these settings in more depth. But the one thing that we need to focus on in here more than anything is the render. So when we click on render here, it says at present render as halos. So when I click play, you can see these little spheres will drop down, right? So we've got spheres here and they're dropping down, and these are called halos here, and they're temporary particles. So if you're just building a simulation but you don't really care what the particle looks like, you're just more interested in the physics and the dynamics, then we can say that Blender's giving us a temporary particle within the viewport here to experiment with. But we don't want that. We want to click on the drop down and we want to select object here, and then it says instance of object, and we're going to select particle 1. So now we can see little cubes dropping down, right? And if we click play, we see these little cubes dropping down. Let's just go to file, save, and we'll press F12 on our keyboard, and that will render out the scene. Let's just see if this will do something. Here we can see these little cubes dropping down, right? So it's not that impressive, it's just little cubes. And we can see the light source is kind of over here somewhere, if we can see that in our camera. So we can see the light source is here. This is why we're getting some sort of lighting coming down on the top here. Now let's just press 0 on our keyboard. 0 takes us into the camera perspective, so we can see almost like what the render looks like. And for the minute, I'm just going to turn off the overlays. So when we turn off overlays, it just stops the little sort of highlights around the particles. We can just see them a bit clearer. Let's zoom in a little bit more, and we can see they're quite small, right? And we can scale these particles in 2 ways. First thing we can do is click on the cube itself, the actual particle itself, and then press the letter S on our keyboard, and then we can actually change the size of the object, and that will change the size of the particles. Now there's another way to do that. That is not probably the most advisable way. What you should do really is go to the particle emitter, and inside the render settings here, render, you'll see scale. So right now it's set to 0.05 right here, and if I were to just left click and drag, I can change the size of the particles. So I can make them really, really small. I can make them like sort of this sort of size, any size that I want, but every single particle will be exactly the same size, right? So let's just set it to like 0.1, so it's double the size of what it was before. So if I middle mouse click and zoom in here, you can see each individual particle is the same size. They're all the same size. Let's press 0 on our keyboard again. That takes us back into the camera view, and we've got another option here to randomize the size of the particles. So I like to place randomization now as our default size is 0.1, but we've got full randomization now. All of the cubes are of random sizes, right, between those values. So you can see here, when we zoom in and look around, we can see small cubes, bigger ones, medium size, and so forth, right? So let's press 0 again on our keyboard. That takes us back into the camera view, and let's just go to file, save. So obviously these particles don't look too great, so let's just make something. We're doing this tutorial, so let's just do something logical. So let's go ahead and click on the particle itself. Remember, this is the particle for now, and we just go to the material. Let's add a new material. So we'll click add material, and we're going to go to the emission shader. So we'll go to emission shader here under the surface emission, and we'll set it to a value of 5 for the moment, and we'll give it a color. Let's just make it any color. Let's make it like let's do it like a light blue color, right? Something around here, this sort of color. Now obviously you can't see that in the viewport until you go to the render view. Now you can see blue particles, right? Blue particles in the viewport. Let's press 0, so make sure you're in this render view here, and let's just go to file, save, and zoom back out a little bit. This is the camera view. Let's go over to the render settings here, render properties, and turn on the bloom. Now our particles will glow because these particles are emission, right? We applied an emission shader to it, and emission means that they are almost behaving like light objects, and those lights can emit these blooms, right? But we can change the settings here. So like the radius, we can just scale that down a little bit. It's a bit too much. So now you can see like this little haze around the particles. The better way to see it is to go to the world settings, and inside the world settings we can change the background color here. So we can make it black. Now we can see the glow around the edge. Is quite finite at the moment, but if we went back here and changed the radius, you can see that we can fluctuate that size. Something around here should look pretty good, right? So we can just go back here and click this button to go back to the beginning of the timeline. We don't see any particles, we click play, now these particles will drop down like this, right? So let's go back, let's make this tutorial a little bit more interesting. Let's save this as version 2 now, so it's going to save as version 2, and I want to create in fact, before we do anything else, let's just show, because in the questions that he asked, he was asking about how many particles get emitted and so forth, right? So let's go back to the particle emitter, and remember, the particle is just the object that we're creating to be rendered. All of the settings for the particle animation are in the particle emitter. So when we go to the particle system here, let's go right to the top, number of particles. So right now it's set to 1,000. Let's just do something really stupid and set it to like 50,000, right? 50,000. Be a bit careful. If you've got a slow machine, then maybe set it to like 3,000 or 4,000. So let's just click play. Now we see 50,000 particles being emitted. Right, that's a bit overkill, obviously, because it's just not looking right. So let's set this to something like 5,000, 5 times the original amount, and we'll go back and click play. Now you can see 5,000 particles being emitted. Now these particles get emitted over a specific duration, and if you look here, it says down here, it says the end frame is 250 frames, and it says the start frame is 1, and the very last particle will be emitted on frame 200, and the lifetime of the particle is 50 frames. So really, this simulation would run all the way across this whole timeline, and when we get to the very end, let's just scrub across here towards the end, we should see that when we get right towards the end, no more particles are being displayed right here, right? So we can change when these particles start to be emitted. Right now they're emitted on frame 1, but if we were to say, for example, emit on frame 150, so that's all the way down here, can you see the red line? It might be a bit faint here, but the red line doesn't start till this point. So if I click play, nothing happens, and when we get to 150 frames, let's be a bit patient, all of a sudden we see particles, right? Now these particles will always be rendered at this particular point, right, at frame 150, but at frame 200, if we see here at frame 200, that's when they stop being emitted. So all 5,000 particles will be emitted between 150 and 200 frames. So if I set this number 200 to something like 160, then within 10 frames all 5,000 particles will be emitted. So it's a very finite piece of time, right? Only 10 frames. So if I were to just move this cursor back a little bit and click play, we're going to see a load of particles all in one go, right? Tons of them. They're all being emitted within that time frame, only 10 frames. So if we were to take this 150 and change it to something like 50, now you can see the red line goes for this duration. The reason why it extends beyond frame 160, this red line, is because the particles last 50 seconds. So on frame 160, the very last particle will be emitted, but 60 or 160 plus 50 will take us to 210. So the very last particle to be displayed in the scene will be at frame 210. Now, because they last for 50 frames. But let's set this to something like 10 frames. 10 frames, right? So they only last for 10 frames. So more than likely, if we go back, the particles may not even make it all the way down to here. Let's click play and check that. So now they're going to render at frame 50. And you can see they don't even get anywhere close to the bottom, because by the time the particle's been rendered and its lifetime is only 10 frames. So if I render it at 50 frames, within 10 frames, at 60 frames, that particle's already died out. So it doesn't have enough time to float all the way down and do its stuff, right? So if we set this to another number, like let's say 25, we should see our particles will get probably down to about the midpoint of this camera view. So let's click play now, and we'll see they will get down, but they'll kind of stop midpoint, right? So 50 frames was kind of ideal because that gets us past the camera view, and that's kind of what we want. So let's set this back to 50. Then you can do random lifetimes. If I set random lifetime all the way to the top and click play now, the particles will now have random lifetime. So some will last all of the full 50 frames, some will last less than 50 frames, right? It's randomization of their lifetime. This seed option here just randomizes the particle generation, right? So if we were to set this to something like 10 particles and click play, we'll see these 10 particles. In fact, let's make life easier. Let's just set them back to 0 frames, right? Or 1 frame. Set it to 1 frame here to start, and we click play. Then we see these 10 particles being emitted, right? Like this over this duration. And if we were to set this seed to a different value, then the particles being generated is still 10 particles, it's still all the same settings, but the where they're generated off of the actual plane is different now, right? So when they drop down, they'll be in a different sequence. You can almost think of it that way, right? You can do some interesting things with this these seeds, but for now we'll leave the seed at 0, and if we set it back to 0, then it's back to its default settings, right? Maybe we set it to something like 100, and if we click play, let's say at frame, I don't know, let's say frame 30, a nice number, right? Frame 30, we see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 particles in the scene, right? 2 big ones up here, small one, and so forth. If we set the seed to 1, and then go back to, let's just go back on the timeline, and then scrub forward to frame 30, we now only see 2 big particles. We see a difference, right? Because the seed is different, the way the particles are being emitted. Okay, so let's just go back and let's just go to file, save as, and let's save this as version 3. Okay, I'm going to have a bit of random fun. I'm sitting here in front of the computer. We've already built this particle simulation. So let's just make something out of it, and maybe we can teach you something as well. And we can learn a few things from this as well. Right, so inside of the settings here, there's other options. There's field weight. And with field weight, we can change the gravity. So as default, Blender would I feel, correct me if I'm wrong, but Blender is simulating Earth's gravity as default, right? So if we were to set the gravity all the way down to something like 0.3 and then go back and click play, our particles will drop slower, right? They will just drop slower. Yep, you can see they're not even making it down towards the bottom here because there's less gravity. If we turn the gravity all the way off and then click play, the particles will start to float upwards. Can you see? Right? And if we give it a bit more gravity, then they'll start to drop down like this. So you can change the gravity to affect how these particles drop down. And you can also do things like in the physics section. So when we go to physics, I don't really play around with these settings too much. I'm not a physicist, so I don't really know a lot about these options in here. But one that I do like to try and test out sometimes is browning. And that actually gives a bit of randomization. So let's just go back. Let's just see. Let's just middle mouse click. Let's turn back on our overlays so we can see a bit clearly what's going on here. And let's turn up this browning. Let's set it all the way up to 5, something like 5, or even higher. Right? And let's press 0 again. Now let's just go back to our camera view, 0. And if we watch now, the particles don't float just straight downwards, right? They're kind of moving a bit side to side. And as we increase this Brownian value, you can set it all the way up to 20. You see the particles don't just drop in a straight line. Now they're sort of moving off to the side a little bit, yeah? So that's what Brownian does. Drag, I assume, is really, it would be nice if Blender, when you hover over these options, it tells you exactly what they do. But let's just set the drag all the way up to 1. And let's just see what happens here. Let's go back. I think that's more to do with almost like drag in terms of wind, right? Resistance, drag resistance. So I'm not going to worry about these options, these couple of options in here too much, but I did want to show you at least this Brownian option because that can be quite interesting. But there's other ways to do that, right? So if we set the Brownian all the way down to 0, if we wanted some randomization in this particle system, we can just press Shift A, go to let's see, Shift and A, and then we'll go to force field, and then we can add something called a turbulence here, turbulence. So when we add turbulence to the scene, here it's called field, so let's just call it field TUR, and we'll go to the physics settings. Let's go to field, let's go to its physics settings here, and then we can increase the strength of the turbulence. And as we increase the strength, we should see some randomization. It's quite high, around 6. Let's just let it loop back again, and let's just see here. We should see some turbulence here. Let's just increase it more. Now you can see the movement of the particles, right? If we increase it even more to like around 20, and then move back again, now we can see they're not falling down in a straight line. They have some randomization to the particles, the way that they're moving, yeah? And really we haven't got that many particles in the system, so let's go back to this particle emitter. Let's go back to the particle settings, and we've got 100 in here, so let's set it to something like 2000, and then we can see the movement of this randomization a lot clearer now. Now you can see them moving a lot more randomly, right? So let's pause this, let's go back, and the particles right now are falling through the floor, right? So we can add quickly add a mesh. Let's press Shift A, add another mesh, a plane, and let's press let's see, let's press let me see what's the best way to do this. Let's turn back on our we've got our screen, we've got our overlays on at the moment, so let's just middle mouse click. Let's just take this mesh and press S to scale, and let's just scale it up. Let's scale it up quite big to something like this, and then press 0, and let's drag that down, and we can see let's set it to somewhere like around here, right? So we can still see the floor like in the background here. And then if we go to the physics settings here and set it to collision, and then go back and click play, now our particles will manage to hit the floor. Not all of them, because we've got randomization on them, right? So when we go back to the particle emitter, we can see we have random lifetime. So if we reduce that random lifetime, all the particles will get to hit and bounce the floor. But let's just set it back to 1 because it kind of looks a bit better. And let's reduce our particles down to maybe around 500. All right, we'll turn off our overlays and we can see that simulation a bit better. Like this, we've got shadows and stuff going on here. Let's just go back. Play. So we're seeing some issues here, right, in the particle system. So it's always worth going to File, Save, and then go back and click play. Kind of see some craziness going on here. Let's see, it looks fine from this view. It's doing some craziness, so let's just pause it, go back, and we've probably got to bake it, right? So let's try and one thing in here is called bake, so let's just minimize this one, the physics render. It might be in render. Let's have a look, where is it gone? Caching here. Let's just bake here, just click bake all dynamics, and let's just see if that plays out correctly now. And that will play out correctly, right? Problem is when your animations start to, or when your particle systems start to get complicated, as default, Blender's trying to render out or simulate the particle system without having memory of what's going on. So we have to go and bake the dynamics of these particles so that Blender can play them out smoothly. So if I move my mouse cursor across this and scrub really fast, you can see the simulation will play correctly, right, without any issues. So let's just do a couple more things. I'm having fun, so let's just do one more thing. Let's click on this cube and press Shift D to duplicate it and hit enter, and then let's just drag it to the side. So now we've got 2 cubes. Let's click on this one. It's called particle 001. Let's just call it particle 2. Let's click on it. Let's go to the particle system here and change its color. So they're both inherent in the same color. So let's click here. Let's click on this particle system, delete the remove the material, add a new material, go to the emission shader, set it to 5 value for this particle, and we'll set it to like a green color. And when we click play, we still see only blue particles. So how do we get both of these particles inside the simulation, or how do we get 3 or 4? Let's just do 2 for now. In fact, yeah, let's just do 2 for now. We've got green and blue, that should be fine. So what we'll do is create a new collection. So let's just go up to here where it says scene collection. Up here we're going to right click and create a new collection and call it particles. And then take particle 1, hold down the shift key, click on particle 2, and drag them into this collection here, into the collection. Then click back on the plane, and is it plane? That's the floor, right? So let's call this floor, and click back on the particle emitter, should I say. Go to the particle system, and inside the render, let's delete the bake first. So let's see, we need to delete all bakes. Just click here, delete all bakes, and that will just remove the cache of the bake. And then we can press Ctrl S to save. We'll leave the cache open because we want to go to the render settings here, and inside the render settings, instead of object, we're going to select collection, and then we're going to select particles. And if we click play now, we should see the 2 different colors right here. That all seems to play out okay without baking it for some reason. So we'll take that as a blessing, and we'll just see. So okay, all right, that's pretty good. Let's just click on this floor. Let's give it a material. Let's click new, and let's make it something like a dark grey sort of color, and we'll make it metallic. Let's make it shine, and let's bring down the roughness here. Let's just go back and click play. Okay, so we've got a basic particle simulation. The guy just wanted to know how to change the size of the particles, so we've done that. We've shown some other sort of options inside Blender in terms of the speed of the particle. Let's just go back to the particle settings here quickly, particle emitter, and let's just see if there's anything else we can do in here that will help him to understand a bit more. I do know there's rotation in here, so let's just open up rotation, and let's set it to normal for the moment. Let's just see. Let's set the randomization all the way up, and let's see, phase, rotation around the chosen orientation axis. So let's set the axis to the Z axis, because then that's the vertical axis, right? And then the phase is the rotation around the chosen orientation axis. This is the randomization of the rotation and the randomization of the phase. So let's just set that all the way up to the top. And in theory, our cubes now, can you see they're rotating? It might be a little bit hard to see because they're moving pretty fast, but they're not all basically vertical, right? They're not all in their default state like this. Now they've got some rotation and randomization to it. I guess if we scrub a few frames, we can see that a bit more clearly, right? So there you can see rotation of the particles inside the simulation as well. I don't think I did that in my last tutorial, so that's quite interesting that we went through that as well. And we could rotate on a different axis here, right? Can rotate on different axes. So I'll leave you to play around with that. Angular velocity. Let's see. Let's have a little read. What axis is used to change the particle rotation with time? So let's see. Let's do the x-axis, and let's just set it up to something quite high, and let's see if we can rotate them as well. Let's just click play. So in theory, they're a bit hard to see, but in theory they should be rotating as well. Let's set it to a higher value. Let's see if we can get it to rotate as well. They're a bit hard to see. I'll leave you to play around with this, but let's try velocity and see what happens here. Let's save our work as well. Click play. It should be kind of, I think the wisest way to do this, or to see it, let's just set it to one particle, and let's set the randomization off. Let's just click play. Let's go back, click play. Now we can see this one particle and how it's behaving. It's very hard to see what it's doing if you can't really see the particle, right? And I guess we could set its lifetime much longer, then it will last a lot longer. We can see what's going on with the particle. Now you can go and experiment with these settings and understand how they're affecting the particle itself, right? So I'll leave you to go and experiment with them. Read up in the manual as well. You can find out more information about these particle settings. I'm still learning myself, right? Blender's not my full-time job, so I'm a web developer. So all of this stuff that I learn in Blender is literally just for fun. I'm just interested in it, so that's where I get my interest from to go and learn these things. So let's set this back to 50, and let's set it to maybe like 50 particles, and then we can just see these particles dropping down. And that's for you to go and experiment. So far through this tutorial, we're going to end it now, but we've been through how to add the particles, how to change the number of particles, how to add some randomization, right, using the force field We use the turbulence, and there's other force fields in there for you to experiment with. Check my other tutorial where I went through them in a bit more detail, like the vortex and so forth. We've talked about the start frame, the end frame, the lifetime, so how long these particles last in the simulation, the randomization of it as well. This is quite important. One thing you should always note, I did explain this in my previous tutorial, but if you go to render, make sure you bake the settings, bake all the dynamics before you choose to render something. So we press F12, we'll see the particles correctly, right? But if you don't bake the dynamics and you go and render, especially if it's a long scene, your particles won't render correctly. You'll have a problem, yeah? We looked at rotation, we looked at the physics as well, and we looked at the collection the render as an object and a collection. So we created multiple particles. You can go and create more particles inside of here. You can have like 50 particles, for example, right? So if we wanted to add another color in here, we can just go ahead and click on this one, press Shift and D to duplicate. Let's just drag it up, click on it, go to its material, delete that material, add a new one, and we set it back to the Emission Shader. Let's give it a yellow color and then set the strength to 5 as well. We can set it to another number like 50, then it will be like very bright, right? Can you see how these yellow ones are way more brighter than the other colors? Now we've got 3 different colored particles in the system, and these ones happen to be like these little glowing ones, which is quite interesting actually. So we also looked at we didn't really look at any of these other settings. I need to go and learn them a bit more before we go through such settings, but we did let's see, 1 minute, let's go back to our particle emitter. Let's scroll down here. This stuff here I'm not too sure about, so maybe we'll look at that in another tutorial. Let's see, we can do one thing in here, and we can pick random, yeah? So if I untick random, what this basically does is, if we've got 3 particles in the system and we have, let's say, 50 particles, Blender will try to pick, or Blender will pick, it will take that number of particles and divide it by 3, yeah? So if we were to set this to 60, which will be a more sensible number, let's delete the bake, delete it, set it to something like 60. Then in theory, if Blender is using the particles here, and if it's not random, then it will be an even number of particles. So there should be 20 of each, basically, right? There will always be 20 of each in this sequence. But if we randomize them, then Blender's just randomly picking. It could just be any number. You might get more yellows than greens or blues and so forth, right? So that's quite a nice option to look at as well. Object rotation. Use object rotation, duplicate, blah blah blah, particle. Okay, I'm not sure about that. So it says show particles after they have died. Some of these other settings we're going to go through. I need to read up on them and understand them a bit better. I don't want to try and explain something I don't understand. But here's the gravity. The vortex, I believe now, you can actually create a collection. Maybe I'll go through that in the next tutorial. But I did do that in a previous tutorial where you can actually create different fields. So you can have a vortex field, and you can have like a gravity field, and you can have like 2 completely different particle simulations, and you can control the particles using 2 different fields. Yeah, it's a little bit complex to explain, but maybe that will be my next tutorial, because that's really interesting that you can have 2 different simulations in the same scene, and you can one can be using a vortex and the other one can be using a wind object, and you can actually manipulate them completely independently. So that's quite interesting. So let's go ahead and go back to the first frame. Let's go ahead and save this. I'm going to minimize this. It was just supposed to be a tutorial about how to change particle sizes, but I've got a bit carried away like usual. So we'll end the tutorial here. Hopefully that helps the guy that asked the question. If you've got any questions, feel free to write them in the YouTube comments, and I'll try and answer your questions. And don't forget to check out my playlist of Blender tutorials. I'll put a link to that also in the playlist or in the YouTube description. Okay, that's the end of this tutorial, and I look forward to seeing you in the next DCP web tutorial.